So the key aims are reflecting on how you currently feel about having conversations around sexuality and gender with young people, considering some of the barriers that might be present when you're hoping to have these conversations with them, reflecting a little bit on the research, what research says around professionals having these conversations with young people, and understanding the importance of initiating conversations around gender and sexuality with young people too. And hopefully at the end, there may be some useful tips as well around navigating these conversations. So I've kind of broken it up into 5 key sections. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about language, terms, that kind of thing, some definitions, but I would encourage everyone who feels that they need to hear a little bit more to go away and do that research afterwards. And then I'll be talking a little bit about my own research and what some more recent research has said on the topic. Then moving on to actually, why is this important? Why is it important for us to have these conversations with young people? Then moving on to actually, what are some of the barriers to us having these conversations with young people? And then last but not least, some of the things that we might be able to do in practice. Just to say, this is very much based on my own lived experience, my experience in practice, my experience personally, what I've kind of gathered from researching. It's not that I have all of the answers. So if any questions come up, I'll do my best to answer them from my own personal sort of perspective. But yeah, I think it's a topic that's very complex. It's one where you have to very much think about kind of case by case what's going on, factoring in things like risk, and it's not something, as I said, that we have, in my opinion, fantastic training on. So I'm not thinking that this will be the answer. I think this could very much be a module in itself as a topic, but hopefully everyone will have something to take away from today. So a little bit about who I actually am. And a big part of why I wanted to do this is because talking to young people about gender and sexuality, for me, it all comes down to thinking about identity of young people, thinking about who they are, thinking about kind of what is important to them. So to talk a bit about what's important to me and how I identify. So my job, a big one, youth engagement manager here, as well as being a qualified social worker, is very important to me, has shaped my professional experience, very much shapes how I think I navigate even my personal relationships. And a big part of that journey has been the fact that I'm a Frontline fellow, has kind of led to me working here now. But to kind of get under the hood a little bit more, I'm Black British with Jamaican descent. So both sides of my family are Jamaican, and I'm a cisgender woman, and that I'll kind of talk about terminology a little bit later on, but that very much kind of shapes the way that I see the world, but also the way that the world sees me as well. And in addition to that, I identify as pansexual or queer. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about terminology in a second. But that is really important to me as well, just because when I kind of came into the profession, I was very much kind of hoping that there would be guidance and support with working with young people who were in the same position I was, which was kind of questioning who I am, whether or not it's okay to be who I am. And I was a little bit discouraged when I didn't see that. Some of my initial observations when I kind of started in practice were that, little to no training available on how you would discuss sexuality and gender identity with young people. And I think it's important to also mention here, this kind of is important for young people within the LGBTQIA community, but actually all young people have a gender identity and all young people have a sexuality. So as hopefully I'll kind of demonstrate moving forwards, this isn't something that's exclusive to one group of young people. These are things that we should be thinking about for all young people. Another thing that was really key for me in my journey and was at the beginning of my journey is a prominent social worker actually told me that they didn't think that LGBTQIA plus identities were our issue, which got me very angry, to say the least, and was a big factor in me actually choosing the dissertation action research topic that I did. And then ironically, within 2 months of me starting, so about 2 months after that happened, I was allocated a young person in my student year who told me that they were questioning their gender identity and their sexual identity. And that was something that I was then having to navigate almost immediately within practice. And as I touched on, it very much brought up kind of my own experiences as an adolescent, and the fact that I felt like there was kind of a lack of communication, a lack of kind of knowing that it's safe to talk to professional adults about that. So yeah, on the topic of language now. So I thought it would be helpful to go through terminology that I will be using throughout the presentation, but also terminology that you may come across when doing your own research as well. So a lot of this terminology I've pulled from Stonewall definitions. The one around sexuality kind of took from when I was kind of doing my research, but to kind of go through them. So first of all, we've got sexual orientation and sexuality, which is one that a lot of people kind of use interchangeably, but there are differences between these two words, and they are separated as social graces for a reason. So sexual orientation is centered around a person's sexual attraction, or for some people, their lack thereof. So thinking about people then who identify as asexual, whereas sexuality is a broader term and it includes sexual orientation, but it thinks about someone's sexual identity more widely. So it includes things like sexual behaviors, preferences, expression. And the reason that I've kind of used sexuality over sexual orientation when thinking about this presentation is sexuality will also encompass things like someone's values, and that is really important when we're working with young people and we're thinking about, how do they navigate romantic and sexual relationships? What are the attitudes that they have? What are the things that they think are okay? What are the things that they don't think are okay? What is influencing these values? So thinking about things like, where are they getting their information from? Is it online? Is it sort of social media? Is it pornography? And so that's why kind of it's important to kind of select the word sexuality over sexual orientation, because there's so much more that we kind of think about when we take a broader lens. And then we have the term sex. So sex is split into categories of male and female assigned to people at birth based on their kind of primary sex characteristics or their genitalia. And as we know, we have male, female, we have people who are intersex, and people who are intersex, there is kind of a range of genitalia that they may have. Again, I think kind of intersex people could have their own session. It's not something that I think we talk very much about. To kind of move on to the next one, when we think about the LGBTQIA plus umbrella term, the I is very much forgotten. But to kind of talk about that term, it's a general acronym describing people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer or questioning, intersex, asexual, aromantic, agender, plus many other identities. So when I'm talking about gender, I'm talking about a person's innate sense of being a man, a woman, non-binary, or another gender. And when I used the term cis earlier on, that is someone whose gender identity is the same as the sex that they were assigned at birth. So that's why I said that I identify as a cisgender woman, because I was assigned female at birth. Trans is a very broad term. So it's when someone's gender is not the same, or it kind of doesn't sit comfortably with the sex that they were assigned at birth. And there are multiple sort of kinds of trans identities. So in the news, I think we often hear about trans men, trans women. I think there's very much at the moment a real agenda against the trans community. Very much at the moment, there's lots of concerns around our trans siblings, our trans young people, which is another reason I was really keen to do this session. That you may also encounter in your personal lives or at work non-binary young people as well, and that is a term for people whose gender doesn't sit comfortably with man or woman. And again, it's very, very broad. You could have people who feel like they sit somewhere in between, somewhere on a spectrum, or people who feel like they kind of sit outside of that spectrum. Last but not least, talking about the term queer. So it's a term that I've used, but it's really important to understand that this is a term that has historically been used as a slur. For some people, it's still a term that is deeply offensive. Some people would not self-identify in that way and do not see it as a helpful term or a term that should be used, whereas other people sort of in the process of reclaiming that word find that actually it's a term that they feel more comfortable with, because it kind of moves away from some of the other more specific labels, and it's more of an umbrella term that they feel sits better with them. So it's really important when interacting with people to understand the language that they use and sort of how they would like to identify and to kind of mirror that language to be as respectful as possible to them. So moving on to my research. So as I said, as part of my master's, I decided that I wanted to do my action research project on how we can talk to young people about sexuality specifically, but I've since kind of done additional research on gender. And my initial aim was for us to kind of better support the LGBTQIA plus young people and families that we work with. And it was through doing that research that I realized these are conversations that we should be having with all of our young people to ensure that we're supporting them as best as possible. The way that I went about that, I work with 3 young people, all of who were Gillick competent, so were able to kind of have these conversations, able to understand the concepts that I was talking about. And we split the project into 3 different parts. So the first part was around social graces activity and a conversation around identity. So I got the different social graces, asked them to kind of pick which are the ones that were really important to them, if they were to pick 3, which are the ones that they felt like actually were not as important to them or that they didn't really think about. And specifically, after having those conversations, if they hadn't picked gender or sexuality, I was kind of curious as to maybe why. And then number 2, what we did, we had some different kind of terms linking to relationships, and I asked them to kind of put them in categories of if you think this is healthy, not healthy, or somewhere in the middle. So we had things like arguing, for example, which was really interesting. It often went in the middle, and we were able to have conversations around, actually it's something that's normal, but what do they look like and how can we ensure that they are kind of safe and healthy arguments, as well as things like trust, for example, or sort of physical violence. So we were able to kind of put them in the categories. Last but not least, we did some feedback/data gathering. So I spoke with them about how they'd found the process, how relevant they felt it was for them, what they kind of thought of it, and the wider project in itself. And that in itself was really interesting. One of the things that I actually found is that of the young people, one of them identified as bisexual, 2 of them identified as heterosexual, and both of the heterosexual young people were like, oh, so that's why you're kind of doing this. You're doing this because you're kind of trying to improve the community for like the gay and the lesbian young people, without actually realizing the relevance for them. But when I looked at the findings, I found that there were findings from my literature review and from my session with the young people that were very much applicable across the board. So one of the first things that I found when speaking with the young people is that professionals don't tend to have conversations with them about sexuality outside of kind of educational settings, and it was the same for gender identity as well. And these were only kind of mentioned outside of the kind of general sex education classes. They were only mentioned in response to when there were serious concerns or incidents. So if a kind of situation had come up where there'd been kind of the sharing of images, then the kind of conversations may be initiated. Or if there was a situation where a young person had sort of mentioned to a teacher that they were trans and they were worried about their safety at home, then we'd have these conversations. But we were not, as professionals, initiating them with the young people enough. So another thing was that there were lots of gaps in the knowledge of the young people around sexuality. So as we were doing the second activity, what I was also doing was kind of giving them bits of information that linked to some of the words. And what I found is there's a lot that actually they didn't know that were directly relevant to them. So one bit of information, for example, that was really quite shocking to all of the young people was that if you've got a young person who has shared indecent images of themselves with another young person, that actually what you have on your phone is child pornography, and that you could be liable to get in trouble even if you're the same age because you have those images on your phone. And that was something that absolutely kind of blew their minds. We also spoke a lot about things like upskirting, and there was lots of kind of conversations around that at that time as well. But yeah, it was quite, I guess, shocking to see how much they didn't actually know. But more widely, I found that there were lots of gaps in the knowledge of social workers around sexuality and gender as well. So as part of this, I also spoke with colleagues in kind of focus group type styles, and a lot of my colleagues felt like actually they wouldn't really know how to have these conversations, how to bring them up, what to say. And another thing that kind of came through is that they were more comfortable discussing social graces, aspects of identity that were visible. So even though they acknowledged age that it was difficult, for example, talking about race, they actually felt more comfortable having conversations about that than about something like sexuality, which was something that was hidden. So some more findings as well, again, pulling on conversations and on research, is that the young people found that actually it's important that if people are going to have these conversations with them, that they've got positive relationships with them, that there's that foundational level of trust. And that's probably not going to be a surprise to anyone in the room, because as we know, to kind of get any meaningful work done, it all starts with the relationships that you're building. The second point as well was around initiating conversations. So as part of this research, I was initiating the conversations with these young people, and all three of them made some kind of disclosure as a result of initiating these conversations. So one around a domestically abusive relationship that their friend's parents had, and he would often be in that household, and we found out a lot about that. And then there was another one who made a disclosure about a party and about a female friend being at a party and unwanted advances and how they navigated that situation. And these are all things, these were all young people I was already working with. And without kind of initiating these conversations, I don't believe that these disclosures would have actually kind of come to light. The third point is around the power of practitioners disclosing sexuality, sexual orientations, or gender identities to young people. So I, throughout my career, have been sort of fairly open. Where it's been safe to do so is the key point here. And it's all about how you feel within yourself, what aspects of identity you're personally comfortable with within yourself. And it's always important that you never kind of share anything for you that feels unsafe, that you're not kind of comfortable with within yourself, because that can obviously put you in emotionally unsafe situations when doing the work. But saying things like, as a social worker who identifies as at that time bisexual or pansexual, and literally kind of leaving it at that, that helped with young people feeling able to kind of speak a little bit more, particularly young people who are part of the LGBTQIA plus community. But even in terms of colleagues who wear lanyards, kind of like pride lanyards and things like that, it just tells the young people it is safe for me to talk here, and that makes a massive difference. I think in terms of how much we share and use of self, I think it's very much kind of personal choice, and it's obviously important to be boundaried. So you wouldn't share more than a straight colleague would share, but I noticed that actually even in doing that, it felt like there was much more mental work to do, whereas other colleagues may kind of, for example, colleagues who are women may reference husbands, and it's almost like without a second thought. Whereas I've noticed for colleagues who are part of the LGBTQIA plus community as well, it can feel like that is a really significant thing to do. But I would always urge people to kind of have those conversations with colleagues, managers, etc., if it's something that you're considering. But I also found within the findings that when it came to kind of sexual identity and gender identity, as I mentioned, many young people felt that it was not relevant to them, and actually it is. But talking about these things and having these conversations reinforce that it is a key part of people's lives. So yeah, because I was a 2019 fellow and I did my research in around sort of 2021, it was really important for me to go back and have a look at what has been done since, what is kind of newer research saying. It's hard to believe that kind of COVID era was 5-6 years ago, but it was. But more recently than that, the NSPCC has done a really fantastic piece of research called We Have to Educate Ourselves, Prioritising Young People's Voices and Their Recommendations for Change. That was shared in March 2023 and was completed in partnership with Cardiff University and with UCL. And as part of that, I'll make sure that the kind of link is shared, because it's a really lengthy report and it's got loads of fantastic stuff in it. But they spoke directly with young people across a range of different kind of topics and asked them about things like their social media use, how they used it, spoke with them about how they kind of navigate relationships, where they would get this kind of information from. The research very much kind of mirrored what I found, but of course extended on it. And what we found is that young people have a range of questions, range of concerns. They have lots of different feelings around their relationships, other people's relationships, around sexual experiences, and they don't really have places that they can go, or that they feel that they can go to share their views, or to get information from trusted adults. And I'm sure it is the case that many of these adults would be happy to have these conversations with them, but because of maybe the lack of initiating conversations, and sort of making it known that it's safe to have these conversations, young people didn't feel that they were actually able to. And in lieu of that, what the young people were doing is turning to each other for information, or turn into social media for information. And an issue there, as we can all attest to, is then sifting through what is sort of accurate information and what is misinformation. So, in some ways, social media can be really positive, that there are really positive aspects to it. And there are people who share lots of really great information on social media. But then on the other hand, you've got lots of people who are sharing really kind of harmful misinformation as well. And so that was a real concern, because then we're not really accurately filtering what information the young people are getting. But essentially what they said is they wanted care from professionals, compassion and confidence. And they were really clear in this study: you guys are waiting far too late to start to have these conversations with us. Actually, we should be having these conversations much, much, much earlier. So I've touched on some of these points. Why is it important for us to have these conversations? First of all, as I said, disclosures were made. And it's not to say every time you have these conversations, disclosures will be made. But actually, I think everyone would be surprised how many times disclosures do come up, because all young people, especially now we've got phones, social media, etc., will have access to information, will see information that they may have questions, queries, worries about. We're also battling widespread information out there. So it's really important that when we have kind of safe information, that we're sharing that with young people as well. It's also really important for young people to have these conversations, to support them with understanding their identity and also honouring their identity as well, particularly in situations where you have young people who may not be accepted for who they are by people within their network already. And thinking more broadly, things like contextual safeguarding, we know that a big part of that is sexual exploitation. And as well as kind of making sure that we're targeting the people who are being unsafe, who are targeting the children, it's also helpful for us to make sure that we've got the young people who have a bit more information themselves to help them to navigate situations on online spaces safely. There's a lot around gender expectations, what we believe men should do, what we believe women should do. Obviously, in a lot of these situations, trans and non-binary people are left out of these conversations, or actually there's expectations about trans people. So for example, there's a massive agenda at the moment, particularly around trans women being unsafe, and lots of these are kind of unfounded, but that information is out there and it's what people are absorbing. So it's really important that we kind of go back on that, push back with sort of accurate information there. And we've also got lots of harmful attitudes towards women and girls. That have always been the case. Same, as I said, with people within the trans community. And also now we will have more young people sharing with us that they are part of the LGBTQIA plus community. So I don't have exact figures, but ultimately LGBTQIA plus people have always existed within society. We've just not had the language. We've not had as much kind of knowledge. And now that actually young people are getting the language, getting the understanding earlier, in some ways it's beneficial because they're able to understand themselves a little bit earlier. But what it means is that it's more likely to come up for us as social workers in comparison to before, when maybe young people maybe having the language and having the conversations a little bit later on. So I'm going to fly through some of the barriers that were shared to having these conversations. We all think that someone else is doing it, the idea of deferred responsibility, someone else is responsible for it, as well as kind of lack of education and worries that the conversation may be embarrassing or distressing. So worrying, actually, the research says that we might feel a bit embarrassed, but also worried that it might be a bit embarrassing for the young person, or distressing for the young person, or distressing for us for some reason. There's also a massive lack of curriculum content when it comes to social work education and teaching and research in general. As touched on before, conversations often only take place when they need to, or when it's felt that they need to, whereas actually what I'm trying to argue here is that they always need to be happening. But also there was a lot of research that I did around kind of use of self, and actually one of the things that I found is that for queer social workers, if you haven't self-diagnosed sort of disclosed around your own gender identity or sexual identity, which isn't to say that you need to, but often if you haven't, especially if it's coming up in your work, one thing that was present for many social workers is that they were finding that they were struggling to be present because they were having to manage their own internal kind of difficulties with having to censor themselves. And I thought that that was really interesting, and I really wanted to include it because actually that was exactly what I had experienced when I first started the role. And then next one as well here, so other barriers that come up for people around their own personal beliefs and values. So in an ideal world, in my ideal world, everyone is accepting of everybody, but actually we know that we all have our own personal beliefs, our own personal values that can be shaped by other areas of identity. So there are lots of people, when I was kind of doing my research and in practice, I found people coming to me and saying, I found it hard to have these conversations because actually my interpretation of my religion is that actually, for example, gay relationships is not okay. How do I navigate these conversations? And actually, I think it's really important that as professionals, we have these conversations because the only way that we're going to kind of make any progress is by being open about where we're all at and how we can all kind of move further. But also kind of worries around discomfort and fear having these conversations. A big one that I think is the most problematic in my mind is the idea that it's not important. So there are still some people who don't believe that it's important to have these conversations. And it touches on what Crystal said, maybe we feel like it's not important to have these conversations with this group of young people. Or what I was saying earlier, we don't feel like it's important to talk to with our heterosexual young people or the young people we're assuming to be heterosexual, because actually we make this assumption sometimes and we're wrong. But also our own personal experiences around gender and sexuality can kind of act as a bit of a barrier. As I said, I found, as the research said, I internally was in such a panic because I was kind of trying to reconcile my own experiences with practice, and I was putting a lot of pressure on myself to actually ace this area of practice because of my personal experiences. But actually that was kind of hindering me because I wasn't able to kind of get into the normal kind of flow that I'd be in. And the last point is some people are just not sure where to begin with having these conversations. So for the last bit of the session, hopefully talking about some things that people can do. First of all, it's just not making assumptions and just being curious with all of our young people. And that's continuing to be curious even when we've had information that's been presented to us. So we might have, usually we will have information that will say a young person's name, a young person's gender. Just being curious actually that it is possible that that isn't down correctly. Pronouns, sort of making sure that actually we're asking young people their preferred pronouns rather than making that assumption. And just making sure that we're also being mindful of, for example, if you have a young boy who's in relationship with a girl, that does not mean that that young person is heterosexual young person. So just making sure that we're never kind of making assumptions around gender and sexuality. As I said, this is a very short whistle stop tour, but just educating yourself and filling the gaps. Hopefully today you might have found that there are a few gaps that you have in some place, and just making sure that you're kind of filling the gaps yourself, doing your own research where you need to, as I'm sure everyone is already doing, building those effective relationships with young people, because that is very much the base for having these conversations. And then once you have that, being bold enough to initiate the conversations. And it's not to say that you have to force young people to talk about things. You've got a young person saying, I don't want to talk about this, and you're saying, you have to talk about this. It isn't that, but it's just that we're kind of bringing these social graces into the room and just seeing what comes of that. And actually, if not much comes of that, that's okay. But then just going to the top point, just continuing to remain curious moving forwards. A big one as well, discussing language that the young people use around their gender and sexuality, and making sure as well that you're checking their understanding of that term. So not just kind of taking a word that they've said and being like, cool, but actually asking them, what does that mean to you? And making sure you actually have shared understanding of the language so that you actually are having meaningful conversations there. And then last but not least, speak to them as you would want to be spoken to around an area of your identity. This is part of who they are. As I said, some people may privilege these parts more than other parts of their identity, and some people less so, but just making sure that all conversations are respectful. And some of the things that I practically would enjoy doing. So part of the training that we looked at was Totsuka, which is thinking about which areas of social graces grab you the most. And I think it's just helpful for us all to do periodically to think about where we're at, because that kind of informs how we show up. But also, the activity that I did as part of my research is one that I would do with all of my young people. So getting them to kind of say, these aspects of identity I privilege the most, these the least, and just kind of having conversations there. In my view, and as the research suggests, actually gathering information around sexuality, we already gather information about gender, but I think we can do it better. But making sure that's actually part of assessments that we do, I think is a fantastic way to make sure that it's being done the same way that we would have conversations with young people when building a picture with them about what they want to do in the future, how they find school. Actually, I think it's important to kind of build that into assessments that we're doing. And then thinking about direct work that unpacks gender a little bit more. So it could be a piece of direct work that thinks about, what is a man to you? What do men do in your views? What is a good man in your view? What is, quote unquote, bad example of a man in your view? Is that the same as society? Is that the same as what your parents would say? Is that the same as what you think I would say? And just having those conversations to try to break down some of the kind of stereotypes and harmful narratives around gender as well. And last but not least, one that I like to use, it doesn't explicitly mention on here non-binary and trans identities, but you can use it as a springboard to have some of these conversations. But the gender unicorn is quite cool because it speaks about gender identity, how people identify, but also gender expression, because actually you can't make assumptions on people's gender based on how they present. So, for example, you might have someone who identifies as a woman, cisgender woman, but actually the way that they like to present in terms of their clothing, we might associate that more with sort of masculinity. So it's really good to start to have these conversations with young people, as well as thinking about things like physical attraction, emotional attraction. So it's something I've used quite a lot. But yeah, that is the end of the presentation. But I've got some resources that I can share, a mix of them, some charities, some resources for you, some resources for families, some resources for young people here as well as I've got references to some of the research, including the study that the NSPCC did as well. So thank you everyone for coming.